In my recent Yarn 101 video, I essentially warned you off starting with yarn that looks like this. This is called a hank, and naturally I did have a couple of questions about how exactly to handle it. So today I'm going to show you how to wind up yarn from a hank with a ball winder and a swift, which is the most common setup. But if you have neither of those things, don't worry, we'll go through some alternatives afterwards. Now, the first thing I need to do is take off the free stitch marker that came with this hank of yarn, but that might not apply to you. A couple of notes before we get started then. First, swifts come in a few different types. I have a relatively cheap one. I think it was just literally the cheapest I could find on Amazon at the time. And the ball winder is from Knit Pro. Both of these things basically just clamp onto the side of the table, so they're super easy to set up. There are going to be some specifics that change depending what type of swift you have, but the overall gist will be the same. Now you'll notice that I have the ball winder set up on my right. That's because I'm right-handed. I'll be using my right hand to turn the handle, so that just makes sense for me. You may want to flip it if you're a lefty. I have them reasonably far apart because when I open the swift to its full extent, you can see it's pretty big and I'm maybe sitting a little bit too close. You'll also notice that I have the ball winder set up so that this metal guide is facing towards the swift and the handle is on the opposite side. This isn't 100% necessary. I'll sometimes end up with them both clamped to the same side of the table just because the rest of the table is full, but that makes it a little more awkward, so if you can, just set it up like this. Alright, so time for the actual yarn. First thing I'm going to do is remove that label, but I'm going to keep it. You always want to keep your label as it has the dye lot and everything written on there. I'll show you what I do with those when we're done winding. So what a hank is essentially a large loop of yarn twisted up on itself. It doesn't look much like a loop at the moment, but you can see it's a very characteristic twist. To open up a hank, you want to check both sides and find the one where one end of the loop is tucked inside the other. I hope you can see that. Once you've separated the two ends, just make sure you've got at least a couple fingers through the loop there and let it all untwist. There we go. That's easier when there isn't a table in the way. Now, I don't like to handle the yarn very much at this stage because tangles can happen. So what I'm going to do is put it onto the swift and then we'll talk about it. What I'll generally do here is just open up the swift a little bit. You don't want it to be really tight when you put the yarn on there. Drape it over. And then with my other hand, I'm just going to open that up more until it's tight. Doesn't need to be super high tension tight, just enough to hold it securely. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just give it a quick spin and make sure that this isn't twisted. So for example, you see this whole section is kind of flat, but it's possible, depending how you loaded it onto the swift, that you might have a twist in it like this, in which case you want to just untwist that and make sure the whole thing is lying flat like this section. Looking good. So now we're going to remove the ties, and this is going to kind of depend on the hank of yarn you're using. Most of them, in my experience, do come with two different types of tie. So I'm going to take some close-up photos so you can see what I'm talking about. These are the simplest ties that just keep the whole thing tidy in the hank. They're essentially just little scrap bits of yarn tied round in a loop. But somewhere along the line you are going to find one of these types of tie where you have more than two ends tied together. What this is again one of those little scrap bits of yarn tied round in a loop, but also the two ends of the actual yarn itself. So since that one's a little more structural, I'll usually snip the other ones off first. I'll try to do this round where you can see, I don't really know, but these scrap bits, they're just tied together at the end. You could undo the knot, but I just snip them. And then with a little bit of finagling, you should just be able to pull them out. See, just a scrap of yarn. I'll go around and do that to all of them. Okay, looks like there were only two of the smaller ties on this one. You can have more, you might not have any at all, you might just have this main one. It's just going to completely depend on the yarn. For this last one, the one where all of the ends come together, I have seen people sit and painstakingly take these knots out by hand, but I've got to be honest, I still mostly just trim them off. Just a little bit of teasing to figure out which bits are the scrap piece of yarn and which bits are the actual yarn. There we go. And then you should be left with your two ends. Let me get the camera closer to this. Alright, so you can see here I've just trimmed and removed that scrap bit. I haven't done anything else with the ends. So I have one dangling here and I have one dangling here. Now normally what you will find is that one comes from the inside or the back of the loop as you've loaded it onto the Swift, and the other comes from the front. And what you want to do is find which one comes from the front, because that's the one you're going to wind. So let's have a look. This one does seem like it comes from the front. Sometimes it's a little difficult to tell. They can be very misleading. They can come from the front for a little bit and then suddenly go around the back. So I'm just going to check the other one, but you can already see without me even doing anything that is officially coming from around the back, and if I try to tug that, it's a lot more difficult. That is not going to wind easily. So we're going to wind with this one. Now, one thing I have seen some people do is secure this in some way to the Swift, the end that we're not winding from, just so that it doesn't get in the way. It can sometimes get tangled around this middle section here, I've found. But to be honest, what I normally do is just kind of put it round the back where it came from. I've just laid it across one of the inner, whatever you want to call them, rods? I don't know. And that should be fine. So the first thing that you do to load up the ball winder is feed your yarn through this metal guide here. And I've changed the camera angle because I want you to really see this, because something I see newbies doing is trying to manually put the end through there, which, I mean, you can see that works, it's fine. But there's a much more magic way to do it. If you hold the yarn behind the guide here, you can just sort of wrap it around that coil and ta-da, you're through. That's it. Magic. Let me show that again. So start off behind, just wrap it round, and you are through the middle. How weird is that? Once the yarn is threaded to the guide, the next step is to just attach it to the ball winder. So you can see there are these two notches on top of the middle section here, and I'm just laying my yarn through those. Editor note: if your yarn is very slippery or thin or just won't hold securely in these notches, you can just tie a knot in it here to stop it from slipping out. Now, if I start to wind this, in theory what should happen is it just winds, but watch what actually happens. We've got stuck pretty early on, and I'll show you why. See, my cheap Swift, and possibly also yours, which is why I'm showing you this, has all of these metal protuberances where the yarn constantly gets stuck. So I'll show you what I do to sort that out. It's not a big deal, but generally what I do is, as I'm winding with my right hand, I just hold the yarn with my left. I'm not actually holding it as such, I'm just kind of guiding it so that it comes away from the Swift horizontally, so that it's not angled down and getting caught on these metal nubbins. I'll mute the audio on this part because if you're using a now old and squeaky ball winder on a wobbly table on a wooden floor like me, this can get pretty loud. But I've not sped up the footage yet because I want you to see that I'm not going for speed, just consistency. The faster you go, the more likely you are to get into tangles and other problems, so just find a nice comfortable speed and stick to it to get nice even tension in your finished cake. At the speed you're watching now, this took me just under 4 minutes to wind the whole ball, which isn't very long, but it's longer than you probably want to watch me do it, so let's speed up the rest. Alright, we'll put that down out of the way because, if I'm honest, I've already caught my jumper on the little hooks a couple of times. Now, before we look at this lovely cake of yarn and what to do next, I do just want to say I made that look very easy. Because it is that easy if your yarn behaves. But I was kind of half expecting to encounter tangles. I'd never used this brand of yarn before, and some are better than others, let's say. This was a very well wound hank. Sometimes you will get tangles. You'll have to stop, you'll have to figure out what's tangled around what and just reset everything onto the Swift. it's not you. I mean, it might be you, but it's probably not you. It's probably just the yarn being a little bit messy. And that's fine. It happens all the time. Don't worry about it. In this case though, and possibly for the first time ever as I've tried to demo something on camera, it just worked. Let's see what we've made. So this is our beautiful yarn cake. Isn't she pretty? Couple of things to note, there will be a stray end around the outside somewhere, just the last bit that came off of the Swift. What I like to do is just kind of wrap it round a couple times and sort of tuck it underneath itself just to secure that on the outside. I don't know if you can see that, but I'll put a photo in if you can't. I tend to be a centre pull kind of girl, so I won't be using that end when I'm actually knitting from this. The end that I will be using just happens to handily be the end that we put into those two notches in the centre part of the ball winder there. There is our centre pull. Now remember I did say to keep the label. What I generally do, and what I've seen a lot of other people do, I'm not claiming to have invented this, is put it into the middle of the cake so that it's just always there. You can always check what this yarn is. And the best way to do that is to just kind of fold it over, place it in the middle of this, whatever you call this part of the ball winder, I don't know, and then just slide the whole cake nice and slowly up over it. There we go. So that label is now secure in the middle of the cake. It prevents the hole in the middle from completely collapsing and losing your centre pull. And yeah, it's just a really handy way to store that, really. Just going to tuck that centre part back in for safekeeping. So this is what I was saying earlier that I've done with the outside end. I've just kind of tied it round it. Oh, you can't see. I've just kind of tied it round itself there so that it stays secure. I'll probably wrap that round a few more times just so it's definitely not going to unwrap while I'm knitting. There we go. Lovely. So that is it for Swift and Ball Winder. But what do you do if you don't have those? Well, there are three possibilities here. Either you have a ball swinder and no Swift, a Swift and no ball winder, or you have neither. And whatever the case, you can still wind your yarn. The ball winder is the easiest thing to replace because you can literally just wind yarn around your fingers like so. You will end up with a ball shape, which you might want to put in a yarn ball or a small project bag or something to stop it rolling around while you work on it. But as far as no-cost winding options go, this is an easy bet. If you do want a more cake-like result, the fancy tool for doing this is called a nostopin? A nostopinner? I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but whatever. Point is, you can get a similar sort of result with any kind of long cylinder. A kitchen roll tube, a giant knitting needle, whatever you happen to have lying around the house. I'll link to a good tutorial on doing that down below because it's a bit out of scope to go into right now. Okay, so the actual winding is sorted, but how about the, swifting? We've seen that the Swift does two things. First of all, it holds that giant loop of yarn open so that it can't get tangled up on itself. And second of all, it spins just to make the winding process a lot easier. Now, the spinning is fantastic. It saves so much time, it makes the whole thing so much more pleasant, and it gives you a more even tension in your finished cake. But it's not actually essential. What is essential is that other thing, holding the giant loop of yarn open. And you'll be unsurprised to hear we can do that in a number of ways without using a Swift at all. One very popular option is just to hang the hank around the back of a dining chair or similar. I have another hank here. I'm not actually going to wind this because I won't be using it anytime soon, but it should suffice to demonstrate. You can just hang this around the back of the chair, you can put it over one or both of the front corners, whatever you need to do to get a decent hold. You will need to guide the yarn up and over the back of the chair as you wind it, which can add a lot of time to the process, but it works. Alternative chair-based methods are to turn it upside down and use the legs to hold your yarn tighter, or to use two chairs so you can adjust the tension to suit. Another popular method is to recruit a beautiful assistant to hang around with their arms out like this while you wind. Probably not a great time for the helper, but I do find this slightly easier than the chair method personally. With any of these methods, you can then do the winding part with a ball winder, or you can just wind it up by hand. Of course, there are all kinds of other ways as well. Some people hold it like this around their elbows, can you see that? While winding it with their hands at the same time. I know some people put it around their knees. I've tried that before and got into such a tangle, but it works for some. Literally all you're trying to do is hold that giant loop of yarn open, so fashion whatever solution you need to. These more manual methods do tend to take longer, and they are more prone to tangles than using a swift and a winder. I'm not going to lie to you about how tedious this can be sometimes, but other times it is quite therapeutic. And not all of us can justify the cost of fancy time-saving tools. I wound yarn by hand for years before ever getting any of this stuff, and it was completely fine. Well, outside of that one time when I dropped a whole hank of lace weight yarn on the floor and it took me almost a week to disentangle. But you know what? That was this ball, so you can see even that ended up fine in the end. A couple of notes in general then. You'll notice that I said I wasn't going to wind that second hank of yarn because I have no plans to use it anytime soon. The reason for this is that the winding process can stretch the yarn a little bit. It just puts it under a little more tension than it would be in the hank, and that can affect your gauge when you come to finally work with the yarn if it's been stored like that for a long time. Of course, this isn't really a massive deal because we're all making swatches that we wash and block and conscientiously measure. But just on the slight off chance that anyone isn't doing that, it's something to bear in mind. And we haven't even really discussed why you would want your yarn in cake form. But essentially it makes working with it really easy as it doesn't roll around like a ball, and also it looks great on a shelf next to your terrifying fuggler. Of course, you can also use a ball winder to cake up yarn that comes in, say, a skein like this, or any other shape really. You are not limited to just hanks. Cake all the things if that's what makes you happy. Now, I did go into quite a lot of detail in this video just to try and head off any questions or mistakes that I made as a newbie, but no doubt I still missed something. So any follow-up questions, leave them down in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And now it's your turn. Are you living the swift and ball winder luxury lifestyle? Or do you prefer to do everything by hand? Any extra tips you would share for someone working with their first fancy hanks of yarn? You lot always have way better niche tips than I do, and I know quite a lot of people do read the comments and appreciate it a lot, so thank you in advance. Speaking of appreciation, huge thank you as always to my Ko-fi members for supporting me and the channel, and especially to the Stitch Squad for sticking with me while I took that time to catch up on everything in January. Marianne Johnson, Sunny, Candy Riley Pettinger, Laura Salets, Enlightened Flamingo, Cross Stitch the Globe, I'd Rather Be Stitching, Angela Sue Harrison, Emily Hobbs, Lee the Cozy Crafter, Sarah, Angela Wells, Enraged Flamingo, Alicia, Louise T, Mel, and Hugs for Panda. I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff.